On the morning of March 15, 1889, the staff of the Belmont Hotel in Newport found a room that felt as if someone had only just stepped out of it and into a silence that would not be broken. Room 237 was empty, its silk curtains still drawn as if to shield a private grief. 2 champagne flutes from the night before stood untouched on the marble table. A half-written letter lay abandoned on the escritoire, its final lines unfinished and unsigned. The faint trace of French perfume hung in the air like a memory. Isabella Fairmont, the woman who had once commanded the attention of presidents and princes, had simply vanished into the gray March fog, leaving behind the detritus of a life staged for admiration and a mystery that would haunt Newport's gilded circles for decades. What followed the discovery would not be a neat unraveling, but a slow, corrosive unspooling. Investigators would dig into bank ledgers and servants' testimonies, pry at locked doors and sealed rooms, and uncover truths so dangerous that 3 prominent families paid handsomely to see certain records buried. Before we follow the thread that led to Isabella's disappearance, pause for a moment and imagine the world that had raised her. A world of marble and music, of reputations crafted with the same care as a portrait, and just as fragile. In 1881, Newport was a theater of excess. Summer mansions rose like citadels along Bellevue Avenue, structures whose cost eclipsed whole towns. The Gilded Age had produced a new aristocracy: railroad barons, steel magnates, shipping dynasties, and nowhere was display more brazen than in their summer playgrounds. Within that glare, Isabella Fairmont reigned. Born Isabella Catherine Aldridge in 1859, she was the convergence of old New England lineage and the fresh currents of industrial fortune. Her father, Cornelius Aldridge, had amassed his wealth moving goods along the eastern seaboard. Her mother boasted roots reaching back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The pedigree mattered, the looks mattered, the raven-black hair, the ice-blue eyes, the figure that made French couture seem hardly inventive enough, and in Newport such things were currency. She married Theodore Fairmont in 1878, a marriage both picturesque and provident. Theodore, an heir to a Pennsylvania steel fortune, steady and respectable, the practical counterweight to Isabella's incandescent social life. Their home, Rosecliff Manor, was 70 rooms of Italian marble and manicured gardens that required 20 hands to keep exact. Isabella's parties became the measure by which society took its breath. Senators and European nobility at the same table, millions of dollars of deals consummated over champagne and caviar, a single invitation, the key to lifelong standing. The local press followed her like a tide. The Newport Daily News ran a weekly column called Mrs. Fairmont's Week, notes on charity, fashion, whom she hosted. She funded Newport's first proper theater and curated the musicians at her soirees. Her opinion mattered beyond fashion. Railroad men sought her counsel. Politicians coveted her endorsement. President Chester Arthur dined at her table one summer in 1883. Her influence was not merely social, it was a kind of soft power braided through gilded networks. But where light gathers, shadows congeal. Newport's social engine ran on rumor and scandal as much as on philanthropy. Reputation was the fragile architecture that supported wealth. One crack and the whole facade could tumble. The first whispered fissures appeared in the summer of 1884, in what polite chroniclers later called the Season of Shadows. It began with Jonathan Pembroke, a dashing architect with a past as tidy as his lines were dramatic. Pembroke arrived in Newport with commissions and an aura of cultivated mystery. A Gothic revival mansion in Pittsburgh, a colonial restoration in Virginia, work that suggested artistry and a private history that sparked curiosity. He was tall and lean, with hair perpetually falling over dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense. In Newport, his presence was arranged with a kind of social choreography. In the rooms where he moved, eyebrows rose and conversations shifted. Isabella met him at a committee meeting for the proposed expansion of Trinity Church. Accounts later described an instant, a glance across a mahogany table, that changed the gravity of both their lives. What began as professional consultation became something far more intimate. Pembroke visited Rosecliff under the respectable pretext of plans and blueprints, but he and Isabella would vanish for hours among the clipped hedges and cedar paths, or lock themselves away in her study. The staff, trained to be invisible but human, began to notice patterns. Her laughter altered when he was present. Letters arrived in his unmistakable hand. Theodore, preoccupied with his steel empire and trusting of his wife's social acumen, saw only what he wanted to. A contractor chosen with taste. He praised Pembroke's work and commended Isabella for her selections. That ignorance would later become a wound. By August, the whispers hardened into murmurings, and by September, those murmurings calcified into conviction. Isabella was having an affair. The evidence in the calculus of polite society was damning. She had been seen entering Pembroke's temporary studio on Temp Street. She had been photographed in close, secretive conversation at the casino. And most injurious of all, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt's maid claimed to have seen a passionate embrace in a conservatory at a private dinner. Newport's social machine, which had once propelled Isabella to prominence, now turned with surgical precision against her. Isabella did not recede. Descriptions from friends depict a woman consumed by a passion that dulled reasoning. She continued to see Pembroke boldly, almost defiantly, as if courting scandal were an act of autonomy. Such defiance only hastened her fall. The break came in print on October 12, 1884. The New York Herald ran a scalding piece under the headline, "Newport's Fallen Angel." A society columnist known as The Observer published a narrative that felt less like reporting and more like an execution. Details of the affair, claims of Pembroke's gambling debts, and allegations that Isabella had quietly sold pieces from the Fairmont collection to settle them. The article suggested she had been exploited, that she had given substantial sums to a man who preyed on wealthy women. For Theodore, the shock was double-edged. Not only had his wife been unfaithful, but she had been, as the Herald implied, a patsy. Their confrontation was private and brutal. On the evening of October 13th in Rosecliff's library, Theodore produced bank records. Isabella at first denied, then confessed, but insisted her feelings were real, that any money had been given out of love. Theodore demanded she end the liaison, return to Boston for the winter, and undergo a slow process of public rehabilitation. Isabella refused. She declared the marriage a mistake and threatened divorce, anathema to two reputations built on convenient silence. She vanished for 3 days. Found on November 15th in a Providence boarding house under an assumed name, she returned with a proposal that read like blackmail or desperate strategy. She claimed Pembroke had revealed to her the existence of hidden rooms, concealed safes, architectural subterfuge, modifications installed in Newport mansions to hide evidence of tax evasion, bribery, and worse. She said she had proof, documents, plans, names. Threatened to expose that, she told Theodore's lawyers, and whole fortunes could crumble. The families implicated were terrified. On November 20th, 1884, a meeting convened in the Belmonts' private dining room. Representatives of 5 of Newport's most powerful families listened as Isabella set her terms. $100,000 in cash, Pembroke's debts quietly settled, and safe passage to Europe for both of them. In return, she would vanish from American life. The negotiations stretched for 6 hours. By midnight, a bargain was struck, but not the one Isabella had pictured. The families demanded further guarantees: separate travel, no contact for 2 years, legally binding promises never to return to the United States or communicate with Newport society. Isabella agreed with a distracted air, almost dreamlike, as if the future she'd imagined had already slipped into someone else's hand. She smiled when asked if she understood exile's permanence, as if sacrifices were small prices for love. The money arrived on November 25th. Pembroke left 3 days earlier on another ship. Everything seemed arranged for an expensive theatrical love story. Then the last week tightened into a sequence of small, deliberate acts that read like farewells rather than preparations. She checked into the Belmont under her maiden name, reverted to the precise identity she had carried before marriage and scandal. Hotel staff said she took her meals alone, received no visitors, and wrote letters constantly, dozens, according to the desk clerk, William Chen. On November 28th, she commissioned a portrait from Marcus Steinberg, sitting for 2 hours, insisting plates be developed immediately. Steinberg later described her gaze as resolute and mournful, her fingers worrying a ruby brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. The images, recovered years later, show a woman looking past the camera, as if already seeing where she would soon be. On December 1st, she spent the day revisiting the landmarks of her life: the casino, Trinity Church, the Cliff Walk, sitting in silence at each place, as if saying goodbye. That night she dined alone, changing into a deep blue traveling gown. The night manager remembered her generosity, a tip too lavish for the circumstances, and the sense that she was using up luxuries while she still could. The final confirmed sighting came at 11:30 p.m. William Chen watched her descend the main staircase, a dark traveling coat about her shoulders and a small leather valise in hand. She moved with purpose, nodded politely, and stepped out into a harbor fog that swallowed her figure within moments. It was the last time anyone would see Isabella Fairmont alive. When she did not board the Britannica the next morning, Theodore contacted the police, and what began as a missing person case opened into a long, cold corridor of secrets. Detective Samuel Harrison approached the case with an investigator's patience and a detective's suspicion. Newport's police force had handled thefts, duels, and the occasional altercation between sailors and merchants, but it had never before been asked to unpick a knot of influence and violence braided through the town's most gilded drawing rooms. Harrison methodically retraced Isabella's last week, interviewing hotel staff, carriage drivers, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen her. And the portrait that emerged was less of a single image than a sequence of small, deliberate acts. She had been closing doors, preparing messages, arranging portraits. She had seemed, to several witnesses, a woman writing the final chapter of a life on her own terms. The contents of room 237 offered both clues and enigmas. Her clothing and personal effects were neat and ordered, either the mark of a hurried departure or the planning of someone who expected to return. Jewelry that attendants had seen days earlier had vanished. Drafts of letters, some with sentences crossed out as if rewritten for clarity or secrecy, littered a writing table. The finished versions were nowhere to be found, and there, amid curling ash in the fireplace, were fragments of paper, charred shreds that hinted at ledger entries, calculations, and 2 sets of initials, JP and WB, The initials lodged in Harrison's mind like splinters. JP suggested Jonathan Pembroke. WB, when matched against the names whispered in Newport's corridors, pointed toward Senator William Blackstone. Harrison's inquiries reached for Pembroke first. The address provided by Isabella's lawyers led to a forwarding service in London. Pembroke himself seemed to have dissolved into the city's marketplace. Steamship records recorded a passenger by that name, but the line's manifest showed he never boarded. British authorities reported no trace of him in major lodgings. The trail produced only disappearances. Pembroke, it seemed, had either assumed another identity or been spirited away. When Harrison turned to Pembroke's past, however, a pattern began to take shape. Abandoned projects, unpaid bills, and relationships with wealthy women across multiple cities that ended when the man walked out with purse and portfolio intact. The portrait of a romantic artist curdled into something more clinical, a practiced man who targeted women of means. The investigation darkened when Harrison learned Pembroke had, in fact, been found dead in a Boston boarding house on November 30th. Officially, the cause was heart failure. The boarding house keeper added a small, poisonous detail. 2 well-dressed gentlemen had visited Pembroke that day, spent hours in his room, then left as quietly as they had come. Pembroke's death had been noted in Boston papers, but had not reached Newport in time to influence Isabella's final choices. If she had planned to meet him, she would have walked into arrangements already rewritten by fate or by design. The seamstress who first complicated the tidy narrative was Mrs. Margaret Winthrop, an elderly woman who stitched for Newport's elite and, by her own account, knew the rhythms and secrets of their houses. She requested privacy and protection before telling Harrison what she claimed to have seen the night Isabella vanished. Late at the Peton mansion, voices in the dark, Isabella speaking with 2 men she could not recognize. For 20 minutes she watched, she said, until one of the men handed Isabella a parcel and she left with them in a closed carriage. Mrs. Winthrop's testimony was precarious. Her reputation was tattered by accusations of gossiping, but she offered a detail only someone present could have known. The ruby brooch, pinning Isabella's cloak, had caught the moonlight in a particular way. What seemed at first like scattered hints began to align when Harrison obtained access to financial records tied to the private negotiations in the Belmont dining room. The $100,000 that was to have secured Isabella's exile had been wired to a New York account opened in the name I.C. Aldrich, Isabella's initials and maiden name. The account, however, was a ghost. The funds sat untouched. Paperwork related to the account bore forged signatures and handwriting that did not match Isabella's distinctive script. Someone, it appeared, had been impersonating her during the final negotiations, or the agreement had been a theatrical veil drawn over a darker choreography. Further unease arrived with the Pinkerton files. Federal pressure forced the agency to turn over reports that revealed a pattern of surveillance. Agents had tracked Isabella and Pembroke, cataloging meetings and movements. The language in those reports was clinical and unsettling. Phrases like neutralize the threat and observations about Isabella's unstable emotional state that read less like assessments and more like pretexts. One recommendation dated November 28th suggested immediate action to prevent exposure of client interests, noting that the target's vulnerabilities provided optimal cover for a variety of outcomes. The euphemism shimmered with menace. The architectural plans that Pembroke had left behind became another axis of inquiry. Building inspectors confirmed that at least 3 Newport mansions contained alterations, hidden compartments, and secret passages exactly as Isabella had described. The plans for a concealment under the Peton mansion's wine cellar were precise enough to chill. A search warrant followed. The warrant was executed on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1890. Dawn found the Peton estate quiet and emptied of its owner. The wine cellar, at first glance ordinary, concealed an anomaly. Measured against the plans, an 8-foot depth behind the north wall had no explanation. With crowbars and deliberate force, investigators broke through what passed for stone and revealed a chamber 10 feet square and 8 feet high, its walls sheathed in lead. Lead, the inspector noted, is a sound-eating metal. Rooms lined with it leaked no voice upward. Whispers died the moment they struck the sheeting. The chamber contained more than architecture. It contained Isabella Fairmont. Her body lay wrapped in a silk evening cloak, the fabric decayed, but still bearing the weight of its final attire. The ruby brooch Marcus Steinberg had seen during their portrait session was pinned to that fabric. The coroner concluded the cause of death: chloral hydrate poisoning. A crystal glass with trace elements suggested the drug had been delivered mixed in champagne, an intimate clinical method that left little spectacle and even less immediate suspicion. Forensic signs told a quieter horror. Scratch marks on the lead lining indicated the victim had been conscious and struggling, clawing at a pane of metal that would not give. A partial note, clutched and nearly illegible, bore accusations against unnamed conspirators, words eaten by time and chemical degradation. The scene read less like an accident and more like a chamber of deliberate execution. The discovery unspooled the investigation into public scandal. Arrests followed. Charles Peton, William Blackstone, and others of Newport's inner circle were charged with conspiracy. 2 Pinkerton agents were accused of murder and concealment. The town that had entertained princes and presidents found its name dragged through trial transcripts and newspaper columns. What many expected to be a rare moment of accountability was instead the beginning of something far darker. The wheels of justice, greased by influence, began to stumble. Witnesses recanted or claimed faulty memories. Evidence vanished from police custody under circumstances that smelled of coercion. The Pinkerton files burned in a suspicious fire at the agency's Boston offices. Bureaucracy and jurisdictional delays crept into proceedings. Federal investigators were reassigned, warrants were contested, and legal challenges ate away at time and momentum. And then the most corrosive event of all: Theodore Fairmont withdrew his cooperation. In a statement crafted by lawyers, he declared an exhausted desire to let his wife's memory rest. Beneath the public phrasing, investigators later discovered a private bargain: contracts and concessions that promised protection for his business interests in exchange for silence. The man who might have carried the case forward instead stepped back. Without Theodore's testimony, and with key documents lost or destroyed, prosecutions faltered. By autumn of 1890, defendants were walking free on technicalities and insufficient evidence. The Pinkerton agents vanished from public life, their files and reputations smoldering in anonymity. Isabella Fairmont's remains were interred in a quiet family plot as the headlines moved on. But the truth, as the investigators later pieced together from surviving ledgers and fragmentary testimony, suggested a colder calculus than simple scandal management. Pembroke's death in Boston, staged as natural causes, now looked deliberate. The same men who met with Isabella at the Peton mansion, Mrs. Winthrop had said, resembled the visitors who had sat for hours with Pembroke in his final day. The hidden chamber's lead lining, a detail built into renovations long before Isabella's involvement, read less like architectural eccentricity and more like premeditated facilitation. The official files closed. The courts declared insufficient proof. Yet behind those dismissals, the slow, inexorable machinery of consequence began to turn, not through indictments and prison cells, but through ruin that looked more like karma than justice. The men who had believed themselves beyond reach found their fortunes and reputations corroded by the very practices they had used to protect themselves. But that is a story for the next section, because what followed Isabella Fairmont's death was not merely the collapse of a legal case, but the long, restless aftermath that would haunt Newport for generations. The families who had orchestrated Isabella Fairmont's disappearance believed they had closed the circle neatly around themselves. Her body lay buried. The case lay smothered by influence. Witnesses had been silenced or frightened into retreat. They imagined their secrets entombed with her, sealed beneath earth and marble. But the past is rarely so compliant. The currents Isabella disturbed did not still. They gathered force, returning one by one to the very doorsteps that had tried to bury them. The first to falter was Charles Peton, within whose mansion Isabella had drawn her final breaths. Peton tried to resume the curated rhythm of a Gilded Age life, yet those nearest to him began to speak of a man haunted long before the law had done its worst. His sleep fractured. He wandered corridors at night. He insisted that someone, something, scratched at the walls beneath his home. Servants quit in quiet succession. Guests whispered of hearing footsteps in rooms left vacant and barred. Peton fled to his New York residence, but distance brought no relief. His business empire, built on frauds and manipulations that Isabella had threatened to expose, soon collapsed under the weight of independent federal investigations. Bid rigging and price manipulation, quietly practiced, quietly denied, rose to the surface, undeniable. By 1895, Peton's steel company was sinking into bankruptcy proceedings. During the liquidation, inspectors opened safes, drawers, and secret compartments, and the papers inside read like confirmations of the very allegations Isabella had tried to warn them of. Peton died in 1897, officially heart failure. Unofficially, the man seemed to have met a death shaped by despair. Those who tended to the body said his expression was one of profound terror, as if whatever had chased him through darkened hallways had finally stepped into view. Senator William Blackstone fell next. In 1892, an unrelated corruption probe uncovered precisely what Isabella had claimed. Bribes and transactions kept hidden behind the senator's library fireplace. The documents mapped a lattice of influence and purchased votes tied to railroad legislation. Blackstone's fall was swift. Expelled from the Senate, abandoned by his political allies, he retreated into obscurity. His fortune dissolved in legal fees, restitution payments, and public disgrace. When he died in 1899, he left behind only debts and a cautionary tale that his colleagues preferred not to discuss. Similar endings overtook the others. Thomas Hartwell, the railroad magnate implicated in price fixing. Robert Sterling, the banker whose institution buckled during the financial panic of 1893. Each downfall echoed the crimes Isabella had tried to reveal. Each descent into ruin played out as though her accusations, once silenced, found other ways to speak. Even the Pinkerton Detective Agency, once the iron arm of industrial power, saw its name tarnish. The same tactics that had made them invaluable to the elite came under scrutiny as labor conflicts intensified. Congressional hearings laid bare a history of illegal surveillance and violence. By 1900, the agency's prestige had collapsed. It would never again wield the same influence. It was not justice for Isabella, but it was a reckoning nevertheless. Detective Samuel Harrison carried the weight of the case into his retirement. He never accepted the neat version, the one polished by lawyers, supported by silence. After leaving the police force in 1905, he spent his remaining years assembling a private archive, documenting every thread of the conspiracy. His notebooks contained fragments of testimony from servants too afraid to speak publicly, diagrams of Pembroke's architectural modifications, and a list of disappearances in Newport during the 1880s and 1890s that he believed were connected. His final report, penned in 1917, was a grim summation. "The murder of Mrs. Isabella Fairmont was not an aberration," he wrote. "It was a method, a tool used by men whose wealth placed them above fear, above law, and it was not the only such crime." Harrison died the following year. His files, discovered after his death, became a quiet scandal among those who read them. A reminder that Newport's shining veneer had always concealed darker machinery. For decades, Isabella's name passed through Newport's households as a warning disguised as gossip. Parents whispered it to daughters: "Beware the temptations of society. Beware the dangers of impropriety." Yet these admonitions missed the truth. Isabella did not die because she strayed from marital expectation. She died because she threatened to expose a network of power that relied on secrecy to survive. Rosecliff Manor continued to host polished events, but the Peton estate, where her final hours were spent, did not. After Peton's death, the mansion stood empty for 20 years. Neighbors reported seeing lights flicker in sealed rooms, hearing laughter on winter nights, and smelling French perfume drifting through cracked shutters. Local children dared each other to approach the property. Few did so twice. In 1920, the estate was purchased by a Catholic charity and converted into an orphanage. At first, it seemed a rebirth. Then the stories began. Children, unburdened by adult rationalizations, spoke of a woman walking the halls at night, dressed in the fashion of a bygone era. Staff heard scratching in the basement, soft, persistent, too faint to identify and too steady to ignore. By 1935, after several inexplicable accidents, the church closed the building on grounds of spiritual danger. Demolition crews arrived 3 years later. Beneath layers of stone and dust, they found additional hidden chambers not uncovered during the investigation. Rooms containing personal effects believed to belong to other individuals who had vanished during Newport's golden years. Evidence that Isabella had not been alone in her fate. And then there was the brooch. The ruby pinned to Isabella's cloak, recovered from the chamber where she died, passed briefly into museum care after the collapse of the criminal case. It was stolen in 1895. Though stolen implied a clarity the event lacked. Over the next decades, the brooch surfaced in estates and private collections, each time accompanied by tragedy. A New York socialite dead in circumstances described as self-inflicted. A Philadelphia heiress found lifeless during the influenza pandemic, a shadow of suspicion never fully dispelled. The brooch developed a reputation, beautiful, cursed, touched by a story that had never resolved. Theodore Fairmont lived quietly after the case collapsed. He never remarried. His philanthropy shifted toward causes that protected women from violence, a pursuit that some saw as penance, others as tribute. His will left a significant endowment to what became the Fairmont Foundation, designed to investigate unsolved crimes against women. Though it never solved anything as monumental as Isabella's case, it illuminated patterns overlooked or ignored by authorities more loyal to wealth than justice. But perhaps the most enduring unanswered question was simple. What happened to the evidence Isabella claimed to have gathered? If she had truly collected documents powerful enough to unravel Newport's elite, where had she hidden them? Investigators searched her hotel room, her boarding room, the routes she traveled in her final days. Nothing. Harrison believed she had anticipated betrayal, that she hid her evidence somewhere it could survive even if she did not. He died without solving the riddle. Then, in 1954, during renovations at the Belmont Hotel, a brick loosened in the basement. Behind it, sealed in an envelope marked with her initials and dated November 30th, 1889, lay the documents. Financial ledgers, letters between influential families and corrupt officials, architectural drawings revealing concealed rooms in more than a dozen mansions. Every accusation she had ever dared to make was inside. The conspirators were long dead. The statute of limitations had erased the possibility of prosecution. But truth, delayed, stepped into the light at last. The collection was donated to the Newport Historical Society, where it remains. Visitors report a chill when reading her letters, or looking into the glass case holding Steinberg's final photographs of her, as if something in the room remembers. The hotel room where Isabella spent her last nights was eventually absorbed into storage space, the number 237 removed. Still, guests and staff speak of a lingering presence, the scent of perfume, the echo of soft weeping, the sensation of eyes watching from just beyond the lamplight. In 1979, historian Margaret Steinberg published her definitive account of the case, reconstructing Isabella's final weeks from Harrison's notes and the rediscovered evidence. Her conclusion was stark. Isabella Fairmont died not for her sins, but for theirs. Her murder was a business decision made by men who treated human lives as ledger entries. Her story survives because she tried, however imperfectly, to speak a truth they feared. Interest in the case resurfaced again in 2019 when the FBI's Cold Case Unit announced a re-examination of the surviving evidence, not to prosecute, but to understand. Time had erased the possibility of legal justice, but it had strengthened the case's symbolic weight. Isabella became emblematic not of scandal, but of the cost of confronting entrenched power. Her story warns that secrets guarded by wealth are seldom harmless, and that those who threaten them may be made to vanish. But it also shows that truth, even when buried beneath a mansion's foundation, has a strange persistence. It waits, it watches, and eventually, it finds a way to be heard. What remains of the mystery is yours to contemplate. Was everything uncovered, or do remnants of Newport's midnight machinery still linger behind walls and beneath cellars? Isabella Fairmont lost everything in her attempt to reveal the truth. Yet in the end, her courage ensured that the crimes committed in opulence did not stay buried forever. Some secrets decay, others endure, and some, no matter how deeply hidden, rise again to trouble the living.